Margaret Henderson's hands trembled as she stared at the custody papers spread across the mahogany desk. The lawyer's office felt suffocating, with its dark wood paneling and the smell of old books mixing with her growing panic. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears as Mr. Davidson, the family attorney, leaned forward with concern etched across his weathered face. "Mrs. Henderson, I have to ask you directly," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you prepared to lose Emma forever? Because he's coming back, and I'm afraid that in the eyes of the law, blood trumps love every single time." Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "She's been mine for 3 years. She calls me Mama." The words hung in the air like a prayer, desperate and fragile. "How can I just take her away from the only mother she's ever known?" Mr. Davidson sighed deeply, removing his glasses to clean them slowly. "That's exactly what we need to figure out. Tell me, who is this James Sullivan, and why is he returning now?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. 3.5 years ago, her quiet life in the small town of Millbrook had been turned upside down in the most unexpected way. She had been living alone since her husband David's sudden death from a heart attack 2 years earlier, finding solace in the routine of running her small bakery on Main Street. The sweet spot had become her sanctuary, a place where the smell of fresh bread and the satisfied smiles of her customers helped fill the enormous void that David's death had left behind. It was a bitter February night when everything changed. Margaret had been closing up the bakery late, finishing a large order of Valentine cookies for the local school, when she heard a sound that would haunt her dreams for months afterward. It wasn't quite crying, more like a weak whimpering that seemed to be coming from her front porch at home. She had hurried through the snowy streets, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air, following that heartbreaking sound. There, nestled in a wicker basket beside her front door, was a baby girl who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The infant was wrapped in a pink blanket that was far too thin for the harsh Montana winter, her tiny face red from crying and cold. There was no note, no identification, nothing to explain how this precious child had ended up on Margaret's doorstep during one of the worst blizzards the town had seen in years. Margaret's maternal instincts, dormant since she and David had lost their own baby during her 7th month of pregnancy 5 years earlier, came flooding back with overwhelming force. She scooped up the freezing infant and rushed inside, warming bottles and changing diapers with muscle memory she didn't even know she still possessed. The baby girl had the most striking green eyes Margaret had ever seen, like emeralds catching sunlight. And when she finally stopped crying and looked up at Margaret with complete trust, something in Margaret's broken heart began to heal. Sheriff Morris, who had been David's best friend and remained a close family friend, launched an immediate investigation. They searched missing person reports, checked with hospitals, contacted social services in surrounding counties. But it was as if this beautiful baby girl had simply appeared out of thin air. No one came forward to claim her. No reports of missing infants matched her description. After weeks of searching, Margaret was granted emergency foster care status, with the understanding that she would care for the child until her family could be located. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The baby girl, whom Margaret had named Emma after her own grandmother, became the center of Margaret's universe. Emma's first word was "Mama," directed at Margaret with a sunny smile that lit up the entire bakery. Her first steps were taken across the kitchen floor of the sweet spot, chasing after Margaret's cat, Whiskers. Every milestone, every scraped knee, every bedtime story and lullaby belonged to Margaret and Margaret alone. Now, at 3.5 years old, Emma was a bright, curious child who helped Margaret frost cupcakes on Saturday mornings and greeted every bakery customer with the kind of uninhibited joy that made grown adults smile despite themselves. She had Margaret's gentle manner, but her own fierce independence, and those remarkable green eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her years. Margaret had always known this day might come. Deep in her heart, she had worried that someone, somewhere, was looking for Emma. But as the years passed and no one appeared, she had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Emma was truly hers to keep. She had even started the adoption paperwork several times, but had never quite found the courage to complete it. The fear of drawing attention to their situation, of triggering questions she couldn't answer, had always held her back. Now that fear had become her worst nightmare. He claims he's been overseas with the military, Mr. Davidson continued, pulling Margaret back to the present moment. Says he's been searching for his daughter ever since he returned from deployment and found both his fiancée and baby missing. He has documentation proving paternity, including Emma's birth certificate with his name listed as the father. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. Birth certificate? But we never found any record of Emma's birth when she was abandoned. Apparently, the birth was registered in a different county under the mother's name, Sarah Sullivan. The father is listed as James Sullivan. Mr. Davidson pulled out a photograph from a file and slid it across the desk. Do you recognize this woman? Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo. The woman was young, maybe early 20s, with long brown hair and those same distinctive green eyes that looked back at Margaret every morning when Emma smiled over her cereal bowl. But more than that, Margaret recognized her face. Sarah Sullivan had been a regular customer at the Sweet Spot 3.5 years ago, always ordering the same thing, a chocolate croissant and hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. She had been visibly pregnant during her visits, always sitting alone in the corner booth, looking sad and lost. Oh my God, Margaret whispered, memories flooding back. She used to come to my bakery. She was pregnant, and she always looked so lonely. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as the pieces began to fall into place. She didn't just abandon Emma randomly. She chose me. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. Sarah Sullivan had watched Margaret, had seen her kindness with customers, had somehow known that Margaret would care for her baby with love and devotion. It wasn't a random act of desperation. It was a deliberate choice made by a mother who knew she couldn't provide for her child. Mr. Davidson nodded grimly. James Sullivan is arriving in Millbrook next Tuesday. That gives us exactly 1 week to prepare our case. I won't lie to you, Margaret. Biological fathers have strong legal rights, especially when they can prove they were prevented from caring for their child due to circumstances beyond their control. But we're going to fight this with everything we have. As Margaret walked home from the lawyer's office, her mind raced with possibilities and fears. Emma was at Mrs. Chen's house, having a play date with her grandson, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. How could Margaret explain to a 3-year-old that the man she'd never met might take her away from the only home she'd ever known? That evening, as Margaret tucked Emma into bed and read her favorite story about a little rabbit who gets lost but finds his way home, Emma's innocent question pierced straight through her heart. "Mama, why do you look sad?" Margaret forced a smile, smoothing Emma's dark hair away from those remarkable green eyes that now held so much more meaning. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about how much I love you." "I love you too, Mama. Will you always be my mama?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Margaret kissed Emma's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of her baby shampoo, and made a promise she desperately hoped she could keep. "Always my sweet girl. Always." But as Margaret turned off the light and closed Emma's bedroom door, she stared at those same green eyes looking back at her from a framed photo on the hallway table. And for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't sure if love would be enough to keep their family together. The knock on Margaret's front door came exactly at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, just as she had been dreading all week. Emma was upstairs taking her afternoon nap, and Margaret had spent the morning nervously cleaning the house from top to bottom, as if having spotless baseboards would somehow prove she was the better parent. Her hands shook as she wiped them on her apron and walked slowly to the door, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. Through the peephole, she could see a tall man in a crisp military uniform standing on her porch, his posture rigid and formal. This was him. This was James Sullivan, the man who could legally take Emma away from her with nothing more than a piece of paper and a blood test. Margaret took a deep breath, whispered a quick prayer, and opened the door to face the person she had been imagining as a monster for the past week. But the man standing before her wasn't the heartless villain she had created in her mind. James Sullivan was younger than she had expected, probably in his late 20s, with sandy brown hair cut in a precise military style and tired blue eyes that held a depth of sadness she recognized all too well. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, and despite his pressed uniform and polished boots, there was something broken about him that caught Margaret completely off guard. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm James Sullivan. I believe Mr. Davidson told you I was coming." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped aside to let him enter. James looked around the cozy living room, taking in the family photos covering every surface, Emma's toys scattered across the coffee table, and the child-sized furniture that had become such a natural part of Margaret's home. His eyes lingered on a recent photo of Emma blowing out candles on her third birthday cake. Her face lit up with pure joy as Margaret stood behind her, both of them covered in frosting and laughter. "She looks happy," James said quietly, and Margaret heard something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "She is happy," Margaret replied, finding her courage. "This is her home, Mr. Sullivan. I'm the only mother she's ever known." James turned to face her, and Margaret was surprised to see tears in his eyes. "I know that, Mrs. Henderson, and I want you to know that I'm not here to hurt her or to hurt you. I'm here because she's my daughter, and I've been looking for her every single day for the past 3 years." The pain in his voice was so raw and genuine that Margaret felt her carefully constructed anger beginning to crumble. This wasn't the heartless father who had abandoned his child that she had imagined. This was a man who was clearly grieving, clearly lost, and clearly desperate to find the daughter he had never stopped loving. "Tell me what happened," Margaret found herself saying, gesturing for James to sit on the couch. "Tell me about Sarah." James's face transformed at the mention of Sarah's name, a mixture of love and heartbreak crossing his features. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, handling it with the careful reverence of someone touching something sacred. The photo showed a young woman with long, dark hair and those unmistakable green eyes, sitting on a park bench with her hand resting on her pregnant belly, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. "Sarah Sullivan," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were going to be married when I got back from my deployment. She was 22, just finished college, and scared to death about becoming a mother. Her parents were furious when they found out she was pregnant. They said if she didn't give the baby up for adoption, they would disown her completely." Margaret took the photo with trembling hands, staring at the face of the woman who had sat in her bakery so many times, always alone, always looking lost. "She used to come to my bakery," Margaret whispered. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, chocolate croissant and hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. She always sat in the corner booth by herself." James leaned forward eagerly. "That sounds like Sarah. She had the biggest sweet tooth of anyone I ever met. Chocolate was her weakness." His smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "I left her with enough money to last until the baby was born and for months afterward. I promised her I would come back and marry her as soon as my tour was over. I wrote letters every week, sent money whenever I could, and counted down the days until I could come home and meet our daughter. But when you came back, they were gone," Margaret said, beginning to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that had brought them all together. "Gone without a trace," James confirmed, his hands clenching into fists. "The apartment was empty. The landlord said Sarah had left in the middle of the night with a baby, and no one knew where she had gone. Her parents claimed they hadn't heard from her, but I could tell they were lying. I spent my entire savings hiring private investigators, following every possible lead, checking hospitals and police reports in 3 different states. Margaret felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she listened to James's story. Why didn't you check with local bakeries or restaurants? If she was a regular customer somewhere, someone might have remembered her. James's laugh was bitter and full of regret. I did eventually, but it took me almost 2 years to think of that. And by then, most of the shop owners I talked to said they might have seen her, but couldn't be sure. It wasn't until 6 months ago that a private investigator found a medical record with Emma's name on it from a clinic visit here in Millbrook. That led us to you. The sound of small footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes with tiny fists, her dark hair sticking up in all directions from her nap. She looked at James with the natural curiosity of a child who wasn't old enough to understand why a stranger in her living room might change everything. "Mama," Emma said, walking over to Margaret and climbing into her lap with the automatic confidence of a child who had never doubted where she belonged. "Who was the man?" Margaret's arms tightened protectively around Emma as she struggled to find words that wouldn't frighten her daughter. James sat perfectly still, staring at Emma with an expression of wonder and heartbreak that made Margaret's chest ache. This was the moment she had been dreading. But seeing the pure love on James's face as he looked at his daughter, Margaret realized that Emma wasn't just her child to protect. She was also his child to love. "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret said carefully, "this is Mr. James. He's someone very special who has been looking for you for a long time." Emma studied James with those remarkable green eyes, tilting her head to the side the way she always did when she was trying to figure something out. "Looking for me? But I'm right here. I live with Mama." James's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Yes, you do live with Mama, and she takes very good care of you. I can see that." He looked at Margaret with something that might have been gratitude. "I'm just happy to finally meet you, Emma. You're even more beautiful than I imagined." Emma smiled shyly and buried her face against Margaret's shoulder. "He talks nice," she whispered loudly, making both adults laugh despite the tension in the room. "Would you like to see some pictures of your first mama?" James asked gently, pulling out his phone. "Her name was Sarah, and she looked a lot like you." Margaret felt Emma tense in her arms. At 3.5, Emma was old enough to understand that some children had different families, but she had never asked about where she came from before Margaret. The concept of a first mama was clearly confusing and a little frightening. "I only have one mama," Emma said firmly, wrapping her arms around Margaret's neck. "Right here, Mama." James's face crumpled slightly, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "You're absolutely right. Margaret is your mama, and she always will be. Sarah was the mama who had you in her tummy and loved you so much that she wanted you to have the best mama in the world to take care of you." Emma considered this information with the serious expression she wore when Margaret read her complicated picture books. "The first mama picked my real mama?" "Yes," James said, his eyes meeting Margaret's across the room. "She picked the perfect mama for you." As the afternoon wore on, James sat on the floor playing blocks with Emma, while Margaret watched from the kitchen, making coffee she didn't want and trying to process the complete upheaval of everything she had believed about Emma's origins. James was patient and gentle with Emma, letting her show him her favorite toys and listening with genuine interest as she chattered about her preschool friends and her cat whiskers. But Emma never let go of Margaret's hand for more than a few minutes, always returning to her side like a small magnet drawn to true north. And every time James looked at his daughter, Margaret could see the love and longing in his eyes, along with the growing realization that Emma was bonded to Margaret in a way that couldn't be broken by biology or legal documents. When it came time for James to leave, Emma hugged Margaret tightly and whispered in her ear, "Is the man going to come back?" Margaret looked at James, who was standing in the doorway, looking like he was being torn in half. "Would you like him to come back and visit again?" Emma nodded slowly. "But you stay too, Mama. Promise you stay." "I promise, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." As Margaret closed the door behind James, she leaned against it and tried to catch her breath. In the span of one afternoon, her entire understanding of their situation had shifted. James Sullivan wasn't the enemy she had expected him to be. He was a father who loved his daughter and a man who was grieving the loss of the woman he had planned to marry. And somehow, that made everything infinitely more complicated. Through the window, she watched James sit in his rental car for several long minutes before driving away, his shoulders shaking with what she suspected were tears. For the first time since receiving that terrible letter, Margaret found herself wondering if there might be a solution that didn't require someone to lose everything they loved most. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling like she had been hit by a truck. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of James's visit and trying to figure out how to protect Emma without destroying a father's chance to know his daughter. Emma bounced into her bedroom at 7 o'clock, completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her, chattering excitedly about the nice man who had played blocks with her. "Is Daddy James coming back today, Mama?" Emma asked, climbing onto the bed and snuggling against Margaret's side. The casual way she had already started calling him Daddy James made Margaret's heart skip a beat. Children adapted so quickly, but was that a good thing or terrifying? "Maybe later this week, sweetheart," Margaret said, kissing the top of Emma's head. "What do you think about that?" Emma considered this seriously, as she did most questions. "I think it's okay, but you have to stay too, Mama. Promise?" "I promise, baby girl." But even as Margaret made that promise, she knew she needed help. After dropping Emma off at preschool, she drove straight to the sheriff's office to see Morris. If anyone could help her understand what had really happened 3.5 years ago, it would be him. Sheriff Morris looked up from his paperwork as Margaret walked into his office, and his weathered face immediately showed concern. "Margaret, you look like you haven't slept in a week. This is about Emma, isn't it?" Margaret sank into the chair across from his desk and told him everything about James Sullivan's visit, about Sarah's connection to her bakery, and about the growing fear that she was about to lose the most important person in her life. Morris listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. "I never stopped investigating Emma's abandonment," Morris said when she finished. "Something about it never sat right with me. A healthy baby, good weather clothes, clean blanket, left right at your door during a blizzard. That wasn't desperation, Margaret. That was planning." He pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer, one that Margaret had never seen before. "I've been collecting information for 3 years, following every possible lead. And about 6 months ago, I found something interesting." Morris opened the file and spread several documents across his desk. "I tracked down Sarah Sullivan's last known address, a small apartment about 20 miles outside town. The landlord still had some of her belongings in storage, things she left behind when she disappeared." Margaret's hands trembled as Morris showed her photographs of sparse apartment, clearly belonging to someone very young and very alone. But what caught her attention was a journal lying open on a small table, its pages covered in a young woman's handwriting. "Sarah kept a journal," Morris continued, putting on his reading glasses. "And according to her entries, she spent weeks watching you before she left Emma on your doorstep." He opened the journal to a page marked with a yellow sticky note and began reading. "March 15th. Went to the bakery again today. Margaret Henderson was so kind to the little boy who spilled his juice all over the floor. She didn't get angry, just cleaned it up and gave him a cookie. She would be a good mother." Margaret felt her throat tighten as Morris continued reading. "March 22nd. Margaret was talking to Mrs. Chun about how much she misses having children around. Mrs. Chun said Margaret lost a baby a few years ago and never got over it. I think she would love Emma the way Emma deserves to be loved." "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "She was choosing me specifically." Morris nodded grimly. "There's more. A lot more. According to these entries, Sarah was sick. Margaret, really sick. She had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder that made pregnancy extremely dangerous. The doctors told her she might not survive childbirth, and if she did, she probably wouldn't live long enough to raise a child." The room seemed to spin around Margaret as the full picture became clear. She wasn't abandoning Emma. She was trying to save her. That's not all, Morris said, pulling out an envelope from the bottom of the file. I found the sealed letter addressed to James Sullivan. Sarah never got the chance to send it. Margaret stared at the envelope, Sarah's careful handwriting spelling out James's name in blue ink. Have you read it? I had to for the investigation, but I think you and James should read it together. It explains everything, and it might give you both some peace about what happened. That afternoon, Margaret called James and asked him to come back to the house. When he arrived, Emma was coloring at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in creating what she called a rainbow castle for princesses. Margaret led James into the living room and showed him the journal entries and the sealed letter. James's face went through a dozen different emotions as Margaret explained what Sheriff Morris had discovered. Anger at not being told Sarah was sick, grief over her suffering alone, and a growing understanding of the impossible choice she had made. She was dying, James said quietly, holding the unopened letter. She was dying, and she couldn't tell me because she knew I would leave the military and come home to take care of her. She loved you both too much to burden you with that, Margaret said softly. And she loved Emma too much to leave her with a single father who was grieving and unprepared. James looked at Emma, who was now showing her coloring to her stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that the adults were discussing the most important decision anyone had ever made about her life. So she chose you. She watched you and decided you would be the perfect mother for our daughter. James, Margaret said carefully, I think you should read the letter, but I think we should read it together. James nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter was several pages long, written in the same careful handwriting from the journal entries. As they read Sarah's final words together, both of them began to cry. The letter explained everything. Sarah's illness, her love for both James and Emma, her careful observation of Margaret, and her desperate hope that somehow, if James ever found Emma, he would understand why she had made the choices she did. But it was the last paragraph that changed everything. If you're reading this, James, it means you found our beautiful daughter. I pray that Margaret has loved her the way I knew she would. But I also pray that you two can find a way to both be Emma's parents. She deserves a father and a mother. And I chose Margaret not just because she would love Emma, but because she would understand how much you love her too. Please don't fight each other. Please find a way to be a family together. Emma needs you both, and maybe, just maybe, you need each other too. James looked up from the letter, tears streaming down his face. She wanted us to raise Emma together. Margaret wiped her own tears, staring at the words on the page that seemed to offer a solution she had never dared to hope for. She knew we would both love Emma enough to put her needs first. From the kitchen, Emma's voice called out cheerfully, Mama, Daddy James, come see my castle. They looked at each other, both hearing the natural way Emma had included them both in her request. And for the first time since this whole situation began, Margaret allowed herself to wonder if Sarah's impossible wish might actually be possible after all. 2 weeks after reading Sarah's letter, Margaret found herself sitting in the Millbrook County Courthouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. The small courtroom smelled like old wood and nervous sweat, and every sound seemed amplified in the tense silence. Emma was at home with Mrs. Chun, playing with her dolls, and completely unaware that her future was being decided by strangers. Judge Patricia Williams was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Margaret had heard she was fair, but no nonsense, especially when it came to children's cases. As the judge reviewed the case files, Margaret stole a glance at James, who sat across the aisle looking just as nervous as she felt. This custody case presents some unusual circumstances, Judge Williams began, her voice echoing in the small room. We have a biological father seeking his daughter and a foster mother who has raised the child for 3 years. Let's hear from both sides. James's lawyer stood up first, a middle-aged man in a dark suit who spoke with confidence. Your Honor, My client is Emma's biological father. Military records show he was deployed overseas when his daughter was born. Upon returning, he discovered both his fiancée and child were missing. He has spent 3 years and considerable resources searching for his daughter. As the biological father, Mr. Sullivan has the legal right to custody of his child. Margaret felt her stomach drop as the lawyer continued listing James's qualifications: stable income, clean background check, family support system. Everything sounded so official and convincing. Then Margaret's lawyer, Mrs. Patterson, stood up. She was an older woman with kind eyes who had handled several adoption cases in town. Your Honor, while we acknowledge Mr. Sullivan's parental rights, Emma has known no other mother than Margaret Henderson. For 3 years, Mrs. Henderson has provided Emma with a stable, loving home. The child calls her Mama and has formed a profound attachment that would be traumatic to sever. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to hear from the character witnesses. Mrs. Chun was the first to testify. Despite her small stature, she commanded the courtroom as she spoke about Margaret. I have known Margaret Henderson for 5 years. I watched her grieve the loss of her husband and their unborn baby. When Emma came in her life, Margaret bloomed again. That little girl saved Margaret just as much as Margaret saved her. Sheriff Morris took the stand next. Your Honor, I investigated Emma's abandonment thoroughly. Mrs. Henderson didn't ask for this responsibility, but she embraced it completely. In my 30 years of law enforcement, I've rarely seen a more devoted parent. Emma's preschool teacher, Miss Rodriguez, spoke about Emma's development. Emma is one of our happiest, most secure children. She talks constantly about Mama and their life together. The bond between them is extraordinary. When it was time for James to present his case, his commanding officer testified about James's character and dedication. A family friend spoke about James's devastation when he couldn't find Emma and his tireless search efforts. Then James himself took the stand. Margaret held her breath, expecting him to demand his daughter back. Instead, James surprised everyone. Your Honor, James said, his voice steady but emotional. I love Emma with all my heart. She's my daughter, and I've dreamed of holding her again for 3 years. But in the past 2 weeks, I've watched her with Margaret, and I can see that Margaret truly is her mother. The courtroom was completely silent. Margaret stared at James in shock. James continued, however, I'm also her father, and I believe Emma needs both of us. I'm not asking to take her away from Margaret. I'm asking for the chance to be her father while she stays with the only mother she's ever known. Judge Williams leaned forward with interest. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Sullivan? Joint custody, Your Honor. I'm leaving the military and staying in Millbrook permanently. I want to be part of Emma's daily life without destroying her relationship with Margaret. Sarah's final letter made it clear she wanted us to raise Emma together. Margaret felt tears running down her face. James was giving up his legal advantage to do what was best for Emma. This is highly unusual, Judge Williams said. I need to speak with the child herself. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when they brought Emma into the courthouse. She looked so tiny in her pink dress, holding Mrs. Chin's hand and looking around with wide, curious eyes. After 20 minutes in the judge's chambers, they returned. Emma skipped back to Mrs. Chun while Judge Williams took her seat with a thoughtful expression. Emma has made her feelings quite clear, the judge said. She told me she wants both Mama and Daddy James and asked why adults make things so complicated. Out of the mouths of babes. Judge Williams looked seriously at both Margaret and James. I'm going to order something unconventional. You have 30 days to prove you can co-parent Emma successfully. If this arrangement works and Emma continues to thrive, I'll grant joint custody with Mrs. Henderson as primary guardian. If not, I'll award full custody to whichever parent I believe serves Emma's best interests. The judge's voice became stern. But understand this, Emma's welfare is my only concern. Any conflict between you that affects her stability, and I will not hesitate to place her in a different home entirely. This child has endured enough uncertainty. As they left the courthouse, Margaret and James walked together toward the parking lot. Emma ran between them, holding both their hands and chattering about the big, important building. "Mama, Daddy James," Emma said, swinging their hands happily. "Are we going home now?" Margaret and James looked at each other over Emma's head, both realizing they had exactly 30 days to figure out if Sarah's dream of them becoming a family together was actually possible. The first week of their 30-day trial felt like walking on eggshells. James moved into Margaret's guest room, bringing only 2 duffel bags and a worn photo of Sarah that he placed carefully on the nightstand. The house suddenly felt smaller with his presence, not because he was intrusive, but because Margaret was constantly aware of him. The sound of his shower in the morning, the smell of his coffee, the way he left his boots perfectly aligned by the front door. Emma, however, adapted to the new arrangement with the resilience that only children possess. She appointed herself as James's tour guide, showing him every corner of the house and explaining the rules in her serious 3-year-old voice. "This is Mama's special chair where she reads me stories," Emma announced, patting the worn armchair by the fireplace. "And this is where Whiskers sleeps, but you can pet him if you ask nicely. And you can't eat the cookies in the jar because those are for customers, but Mama makes special ones just for us." James listened to every word with the kind of focused attention most adults reserve for important business meetings. "Thank you for teaching me the rules, Emma. I want to make sure I do everything right." The daily routine took some adjusting. Margaret handled mornings since Emma was used to waking up and finding her in the kitchen, making breakfast while humming softly. James took over evening duties, bath time, teeth brushing, and bedtime stories. At first, Emma protested, insisting that Mama does it better. But James was patient, reading the same story 3 times when Emma demanded it and making up silly voices for all the characters. Once upon a time, James would begin in his deep voice. "There was a brave princess who lived in a castle made of cookies." "That's not how it goes, Daddy James." Emma would giggle, correcting him with the authority of someone who knew every word by heart. "Oh, you're absolutely right. Let me try again." Margaret would listen from the hallway, her heart doing strange things as she heard James's gentle laughter mixing with Emma's delighted squeals. She had expected the arrangement to feel forced and awkward, but there was something surprisingly natural about the 3 of them sharing space. The second week brought unexpected challenges. Emma came down with a stomach bug, and both Margaret and James went into full parent mode simultaneously. They bumped into each other in the hallway at 2 in the morning, both rushing to Emma's room when they heard her crying. "I've got it," Margaret whispered, but James was already filling a glass with water. "She might need medicine," he said quietly, not wanting to wake her further. They worked together seamlessly, Margaret holding Emma while James brought cool washcloths, taking turns staying up through the night, so Emma was never alone. By morning, when Emma's fever broke, they were both exhausted but had somehow become a team. "You're good at this," Margaret told James as they stood in the kitchen, both running on 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee. "So are you," he replied, and something in his voice made her look up. There was warmth in his blue eyes that hadn't been there before. "I mean, I knew you were good at it. I just meant we're good at it. Together." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned away to pour more coffee, but she couldn't ignore the flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with caffeine. The third week brought a different kind of breakthrough. James had been helping with small repairs around the house, fixing a wobbly table leg, replacing burnt-out light bulbs, things that Margaret had been meaning to do but never found time for. One afternoon, while Emma napped, Margaret found him in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from the small vegetable patch she had abandoned after David died. "You don't have to do that," she said, sitting on the back step to watch him work. "I wanted to," James replied, not looking up from the tomato plants. Sarah used to love gardening. She said it made her feel connected to something bigger than herself. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching his strong hands gentle with the delicate plants. What was she like? Really like, beyond what was in the journal. James sat back on his heels, a soft smile crossing his face. She laughed at everything. Bad jokes, silly movies, her own clumsiness. She spilled something every single meal we ate together, and she'd laugh until she cried about it. His expression grew more tender. She would have loved seeing Emma with you. You have the same kindness she had, the same way of making people feel safe. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I wish I could have met her. I wish she could see Emma now. Maybe she can, James said quietly, glancing up at the sky. Maybe she brought us together on purpose. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Margaret and James sat on the front porch watching the sunset. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the ease of two people who had learned to share space and responsibility. James, Margaret said softly, what happens if the judge grants joint custody? Long term. You can't live in my guest room forever. James turned to look at her, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. What would you want to happen? Before Margaret could answer, Emma's voice called from inside. Mama, Daddy James, I had a bad dream. They both stood immediately, and as they walked to the door together, James's hand briefly touched the small of Margaret's back, a gesture so natural and protective that Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Coming, sweetheart, they called in unison, and Margaret realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, they had stopped pretending to be a family and had simply become one. The final court hearing arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 30 days after Judge Williams had given them their ultimatum. Margaret woke up feeling surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the panic that had consumed her just a month ago. Emma was already awake, chattering excitedly about wearing her special dress to the important building again. Are we going to tell the judge lady that we're a real family now? Emma asked as Margaret brushed her hair into neat pigtails. We're going to tell her the truth, sweetheart, Margaret replied, meeting James's eyes in the hallway mirror as he adjusted his tie. That we love each other and want to stay together. The courtroom felt different this time, less intimidating, more like a formality they needed to complete. Judge Williams reviewed the reports from Emma's teacher, the social worker who had visited their home twice during the trial period, and the character references from neighbors who had observed their family dynamic. Miss Rodriguez reports that Emma has been happier and more confident than ever. Judge Williams read from the school report. She frequently talks about activities with both Mama and Daddy James and shows no signs of confusion or distress about her living situation. Margaret felt James's hand briefly squeeze hers under the table, a gesture that had become natural over the past month. The social worker's report indicates a stable, loving home environment with clear boundaries and consistent parenting for both adults, the judge continued. Emma appears to have bonded strongly with Mr. Sullivan while maintaining her secure attachment to Mrs. Henderson. Judge Williams set down the papers and looked directly at the three of them. Emma sat between Margaret and James, swinging her legs and coloring in a book, completely at ease. Emma, the judge said gently, can you tell me how you feel about living with both Mama and Daddy James? Emma looked up with her bright green eyes and smiled. I feel happy. Daddy James makes pancakes with funny faces, and Mama reads the best stories. And when I have bad dreams, they both come hug me. And you want this to continue? Yes, please. Can we go home now and have lunch? Daddy James promised to make grilled cheese sandwiches. Judge Williams smiled, the first time Margaret had seen her do so. I think that can be arranged. She straightened in her chair and spoke formally. After careful review, I hereby grant joint custody of Emma Rose Sullivan to both Margaret Henderson and James Sullivan, with Mrs. Henderson maintaining primary residence. This arrangement has clearly served the child's best interests. Emma clapped her hands. We won. We get to stay together. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her wedding dress, a simple ivory gown she had sewn herself, looking out the window at the small gathering in her backyard. Mrs. Chan was arranging flowers on the picnic tables while Sheriff Morris tested the sound system. Emma spun in circles in her flower girl dress, practicing her petal-throwing technique with serious concentration. James appeared in the doorway, handsome in his navy suit, looking nervous and excited. "Ready to make this official, Mrs. Henderson?" Margaret turned to face the man who had gone from stranger to co-parent to the love of her life in less than a year. "I've been ready since the night you helped Emma through her stomach bug, and I realized I didn't want to do this parenting thing without you." The ceremony was simple and perfect. Emma scattered rose petals with dramatic flair, giggling when some landed in James's hair. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Emma cheered loudly. "Now we're really, really a family." Their first dance was interrupted by Emma, insisting on being lifted between them, all three of them swaying to the music as the sun set behind mountains. Later, as they cleaned up the aftermath of cake and celebration, Emma found a framed photo of Sarah that James kept on his nightstand, now moved to the living room mantel. "Is this my first, Mama?" Emma asked, tracing Sarah's face with her finger. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said, kneeling beside her. "She's the mama who chose me to take care of you." "She looks nice," Emma said thoughtfully. "I think she's happy we're all together now." James wrapped his arms around both his girls, looking at Sarah's photo with gratitude instead of grief for the first time. "I think you're absolutely right, Emma." As they tucked Emma into bed that night, she looked at them with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children. "I'm the luckiest girl in the whole world, aren't I? I have two mamas who love me and the best daddy ever." Margaret and James exchanged a look over Emma's head, both thinking of the impossible journey that had brought them together. Loss and love, fear and faith, and the courage of a dying mother who had seen what they couldn't see themselves. "Yes, baby girl," they said together. "We're all the luckiest family in the whole world."